The Bible begins with the creation of the world and the story about how God creates the first humans, Adam and Eve, and he places them in the Garden of Eden. But there's another inhabitant to the garden, and that is the devil, and he comes in the form of a serpent. The devil is able to convince Adam and Eve to do something that God told them not to do, and to rebel against him. And that rebellion is what we call sin. And that sin created a separation between human beings and God. God being perfectly holy, but human beings now being tarnished by sin. And this separation is really the dilemma of the rest of the Bible. The rest of the Bible is going to tell us how this problem is solved. Even though human beings had rebelled against God, God still gives them a promise of hope. And that is that one day, one of the children of the woman, one of her later generations, is going to be able to destroy the serpent and the work that he's doing in separating people from God. But in the chapters immediately following, we see that sin is actually getting worse, not better. In Genesis chapter 4, Cain kills his brother Abel. God had commanded human beings to be fruitful and to multiply and to cover the earth. And that's exactly what they were doing. The only problem was that Satan was still having an influence on them and still separating people from God. In Genesis chapter 6, we have one of the more popular stories in the Bible, and that's the story of the Great Flood. The world had gotten to be so wicked that God decides that he's going to destroy all people except those who will get aboard the ark. And so Noah and his sons and their wives are the only ones saved because they were obedient to God in building the ark and then boarding it when the rain comes. In Genesis chapter 9, the flood is over, and the 8 people who are saved are shown here in this picture, and they were given the same command by God: be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And as the world becomes populated, what we find is that rather than honoring God and looking up to him and praising him, people start to praise the work of their own hands. There's a story about the Tower of Babel and how the people really thought that they were great, and they were very proud of themselves because of what they had built. Because they refused to be obedient to God, God separated their languages and dispersed the people. We're then introduced to a man by the name of Abraham, and Abraham is fundamental to understanding the Bible. He's really the foundation, he's the father of the Jewish nation, and the rest of the Old Testament is going to center around the Jewish nation. There was a promise in Genesis chapter 12 given to Abraham by God, and that was that he was going to give him a promised land, he was going to have a lot of children, and that all the nations of the earth, not just the Jews, but all the nations of the earth were going to be blessed through Abraham. Abraham had to wait a long time to have a son, but eventually that finally happened, and that son who God promised him was named Isaac. Isaac has a couple sons, Jacob and Esau, and Jacob is the one who we're mainly focused on here and who the Bible is going to give the majority of its attention to. Jacob didn't have the best start to his life, but in the end he was blessed by God. And his name was changed later on by God from Jacob to Israel. And that's where the Israelite nation gets its name. Jacob plays a really key role because he is the father of 12 sons. And those 12 sons eventually become the 12 tribes of Israel. One of those 12 sons was named Joseph. And Joseph was hated by the rest of his brothers, and he was sold into slavery in Egypt. But eventually, through God's help, Joseph ends up saving his brothers from a famine that had come upon the land. And then he's going to bring his entire family down to Egypt in order to get them through the famine. While Joseph's family is in Egypt, they start to multiply over the years, and soon they become a really powerful and strong people. And there's so many of them that the Egyptians begin to fear them. And the Egyptians decide that unless they do something about this problem, the family of Joseph is going to overrun them and take power. And so they make the Israelites their slaves. After hundreds of years of slavery, God decides that it's time to deliver his people. And he sends a chosen man, and his name was Moses, to do that job. God sends 10 plagues on the Egyptian nation. And eventually Pharaoh gets so tired of dealing with these plagues, and he's so disheartened that he lets the people go. Moses, after the Passover, takes the people out, and they are delivered from slavery in Egypt when they cross the Red Sea, and the Egyptian army is destroyed when they try to cross. God then delivers a law to Moses, and the 10 Commandments are part of that law. This law was designed to make the people holy like God is holy. And there was a list of rules and regulations that had to be kept in order for people to be holy. The only problem was that no one could keep the rules perfectly. And so built into the law was a system of animal sacrifices. People could come and offer animals to God as sacrifice to atone for or kind of to cover their sins. The problem with that is that the animal sacrifices never took away the sin entirely. And every year those sins would have to be remembered and atoned for on a day called the Day of Atonement. Moses' mission is to lead the children of Israel out of Egypt and to take them to a place called the Promised Land. This was the land that was promised to Abraham back in Genesis chapter 12. The problem is that the people are rebellious, and they don't trust God to give them what he promised them. And instead they rebel against him. And due to their rebellion, God curses them to wander around in the wilderness for 40 years. After the 40 years is up, God leads them into the Promised Land and they conquer the land. And they do a pretty good job, but they don't do everything that God told them to do. They don't cast out all the pagan people in the land, and that's going to cause them problems for years and years to come. The pagan people that remain in the land have a big influence on the children of Israel, and they encourage them to sin. And we know that sin creates separation between them and God. And so God sends 15 judges. And the judges' responsibility was to call the people back to God when they abandoned him. And so we go through several periods in the history of the judges where the people rebel against God, they get punished for it. God sends them a judge to deliver them. Then they return to God. And then the cycle repeats again and again. And this happens for several hundred years. This is where we hear about the stories of Samson and Eli and Shamgar and Deborah and Gideon. But as this process goes on and on and on, the people kind of get tired of it. And they decide that they want to be like all the other nations around them, these pagans. And so they come to Samuel, who was their judge at that time, and they say, "We would really like a king instead of judges." God is not pleased with this request because God is their king. And by asking for a physical king to be like everybody else, they're rejecting their one true king. But even though God is displeased with them, he gives them what they ask for. And the first king's name is Saul, and he rules over a unified kingdom. Unfortunately, Saul is only faithful to God in the early parts of his life. Eventually, he rebels against God, and so God replaces him with King David. David is a really important character to understand if you're going to understand the rest of the Bible, because God makes a promise to David that his throne or his kingdom is going to last forever, and eventually that the Messiah, the deliverer of the children of Israel, the person who's going to solve the dilemma of the separation between God and man, is going to sit on David's throne. Solomon, David's son, is one of the more interesting characters of the Bible. He was very rich, he was very wise, and he had a lot of wives. And he did a lot in raising Israel into power and prestige among the rest of the nations. Unfortunately, however, when Solomon dies, the Israelite kingdom divides. It divides into a northern kingdom, which is then going to be named Israel, and a southern kingdom, which is named Judah. The history of these two nations is troubling. Israel, the northern kingdom, has 19 bad kings who unfortunately separate the people from God and are influenced by Satan. And what happens is that northern kingdom is conquered by the Assyrian Empire, and they're taken away captives and spread throughout all the world. And the vast majority of those people never return. The southern kingdom, Judah, is a little bit better, but still a troubling story. They have 19 kings as well. Some of them were good and some of them were bad. Some of them tried to reform the nation, but there were so many bad influences that they couldn't hold it together. And because of that, the Babylonian kingdom took them captive. And God told them that they were going to go into captivity for 70 years, but then they would be allowed to go home. After those 70 years are up, Cyrus, the king of the Persians, allows the people to return to Jerusalem and to the Promised Land. So that's what they do, and here's where we read the stories of Ezra rebuilding the temple, and Nehemiah building the walls of Jerusalem, and the prophet Haggai. And you would think that the Jewish people at this point would have learned their lesson, that they need to stay with God if they want to be successful. Unfortunately, however, that's not the case, and the Old Testament kind of ends in a bad place. The people are separated from God, they're still not faithful to Him, they still refuse to come to Him and be obedient. And that's the end of the Old Testament. As we open up the pages of the New Testament and we read the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we find out that the Jewish people really haven't gotten any better. There's several hundred years of separation between the close of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament, but things have really just gotten worse. The Jewish rulers and the people who are supposed to be keeping the law that Moses gave to these people have corrupted it, and they're using it for their own riches and glory and prestige. And it's into this time that Jesus is born in Bethlehem. As Jesus grows up, he lives a perfect life. He's without sin. Jesus begins his ministry about the age of 30, and he preaches 3 years. He does many miracles, he shows many signs, and fulfills many prophecies about who he is and what he's come to do. And at the end of that 3-year ministry, he's still a sinless man. Even though Jesus was sinless and he never wronged anyone, people still hated him. The Jewish rulers in particular hated him because he was stealing all of their attention. And so they had Jesus arrested. Jesus was then put on trial, and the Jewish rulers had bribed people to come in and say things that weren't true about Jesus. But ultimately, Jesus is condemned to die because the Jews hate him so much. And this is where the cross comes into play in the story of the Bible. This is probably the most popular symbol of Christianity, and there's a reason for that. And that is because Jesus, who is a sinless man, went to the cross willingly to pay a price to close the gap or to close the separation between us and God. This was Jesus' mission, and God providentially used all the events that surrounded Jesus' life to accomplish this. Jesus promised his disciples that 3 days after he was killed, he would resurrect and walk again in new life. And that's exactly what happened. 3 days after he died and was taken off the cross, he rose again and appeared to many people. And that's very important to us, because what it does is it gives us hope that we can do the same thing. That after we die, we can rise again and live with God. Several days after the resurrection, Jesus goes back to heaven. But before he ascends, he gives his apostles a mission, and that is to take the gospel, or the good news of his coming and his paying the price to close the separation or the gap between human beings and God, to take that message out into all the world and to tell everyone. He tells them to go to Jerusalem and to wait there until the power of God comes on them. And when that happens, they would know what to do and how to act and how to accomplish the mission that he gave them. And so in Acts chapter 2, the Holy Spirit is given to the 12 apostles. And the rest of the New Testament is the story about how that takes place. It's a story about the apostles and several other men taking the gospel out and telling the world. So maybe you've heard this term that people use, gospel. What does that mean? It simply means the good news, and it's the good news about Jesus. The bad news is that all of us are separated from God. We are separated from him because there's sin in our lives, and God can't commune or have fellowship with sin. And our desperate need, more than anything, is to close that gap. It's for us to get back to God. But there's a huge price. The cost of sin and the price to reconcile sin is so great that it's not something that we can do on our own. And so God has loved us enough to send us a bridge over that gap. And that is Jesus. Jesus is the only way to God. And it's through his sacrifice on the cross that we are able to have fellowship with God once again.